Michael, the CEO of Trello, he comes up like, hey guys, I have something to tell you. And then he's going through this presentation and he's like, okay, so we're being acquired by Atlassian and we're already like pull up our phones. And honestly, the first thing that I hear is somebody saying, no. And it was a very big acquisition for Atlassian because I think it basically was spending all of the cash they had. I think to be a good leader in like a large organization, it kind of just comes down to like people first, honestly, is they have to have ownership around whatever they're doing. And they also need to have accountability over whatever they're doing.
So you said you were working on your own thing. What is it?
Well, it's AI like everybody else.
You've probably never heard of this guy, but he helped scale Trello to 19 million users. Along the way, Hamid went from humble engineer to Trello's director of product. Trello ended up being acquired by Atlassian. In this episode, we learn how to scale products like Trello and Uber Grocery with a true operator. By the way, this episode is sponsored by our own ScaleUp for ScaleUps, Infobip. More on that later.
So, hi Hamid. You started as a software developer, you're working at Microsoft and some other companies, and you started as a mobile developer at Trello?
Yes, so my career, I think it's interesting. So, I came to the US when I was like 13 and I started making websites and we put Google ads on there and like made money. And then we realized we can pay Google to send traffic to us.
Oh, arbitrage then.
Arbitrage, we figured that out. And it was actually pretty profitable. And then, with those guys, we ended up I was part of like that team that we did Deadneck in Bosnia, which was kind of popular.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, did not.
Yeah, so and then I kind of came back and they did Pick, which is like huge now and all of these things. Oh, it's not OLX, it was acquired. So I came back and I was a developer at Microsoft. I worked on MSN Messenger, if you remember that.
Yeah, of course.
And
we do.
It was a cool time. And then I worked on some virtualization stuff. But I think for me, it was just Microsoft was kind of the job where you just get handed like a deck or something and be like, go implement this. And for me, I was never kind of that person. Like I could do it, but I just didn't, I wanted to understand why and make a lot of those decisions myself and all that. So I ended up joining Trello. And at that time, Trello was still part of Oak Creek. And I was the fifth person on that team. And the product had just launched a couple months before that. And it was like going pretty well. And so that's kind of ended up being part of it. And I actually started just being like a regular server web developer. And, at that time, Trello didn't have we had designers, we didn't have product. We didn't, it's just kind of like you figure out what you need to do and then you do it. And I think that was actually part of the reason we were successful. And there's some of the companies that are actually kind of saying they're doing the same thing. Like I think Linear has that, like the linear way is essentially the way that Trello was built too, honestly. Yeah, so I started doing that. And then at some point, we were like, we need an Android app.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay.
What year was that? Just to understand.
That was 2012, I think, or 2013, something like that. And we just needed an Android app. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I literally remember going back to my desk and I started how to do Android.
How to do Android.
So, I literally Googled something like that. I had no idea. I didn't know Java, I didn't know anything. I was like, okay, well, I need an Android phone. So I bought an Android phone. And we had some code written by a contractor. And I just okay, how do I compile? And we just started at that. And, started building the app and eventually we released it. And then as the company grew, I ended up leading all of mobile. And then doing a bunch of other stuff. So that's kind of how I moved over.
So that transition from programming to product came naturally.
I think traditionally, like if you say, we have a programmer, you have a developer, you have a product and a product manager or something, that people think that is like people, but it's not, it's roles, right? Meaning, you will often see in small companies or startups, people doing both of those jobs. And eventually as you scale, you specialize and you split that up. So we really didn't have product managers until very late because we just didn't need to, and it would have been actually slowed us down. So you kind of did everything, right?
Okay.
And then as the company grows, you get to this place of like, okay, well, am I focused on more this or that? And it's no longer feasible really to do both. And then you have to pick and choose. And then for me, the way I ended up being like a product person, I honestly don't remember, but at some point...
It just happened.
Yeah, I think at some point my title was like, director of product now,
Congratulations.
I'm like, what do I know about this? I don't know. You just kind of wake up and now you're part of the product. Which I think is different than, if you say, okay, well, I went through Google and I went through the APM program and then I got promoted to L7 and then very different.
So product basically happened to you.
Pretty much, yeah. And I think, product as a role, I think, is very different depending on the company. You will see some companies where you basically you take some stuff from people, you write a document, you chuck it over the wall to the developers and your job is done. And then you'll see companies, for example, Atlassian is like this, or changed a little bit now, but is like this, which is like, you're the PM, you own this product, you have P&L responsibility on this, congratulations. Which is very, very different, because then you're expected to understand what's going on with the sales team. Yeah. Nobody on sales reports to you, you have nothing, but you have to know your pipeline, all of that stuff.
We'll get to that. Let's stay on Trello for a bit. So Trello was a popular product from the beginning. Basically, it was created at Fall Creek. It had Joel Spolsky's reputation behind it.
We used it.
Yeah, we used it, so that helped. Obviously, how did product management change as Trello was growing? So from those early days with no Android app to millions of users, what did you observe? What did you learn?
Well, I think we went from having no product managers to eventually having like a couple.
Okay.
Because it goes from, if you're going to go into like what a product manager does and that as a role, it's really just figuring out like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And making sure that all the customers are happy, right? And it's a thing that's needed more at scale rather than when you're just trying to figure something out, I think, honestly. So, this company that we're building now, like, we're not going to have PMs until we're very big.
So what does very big mean in your world? How would you define?
50 plus.
Okay.
Because you also need some element of like coordination and all that stuff. So answering your question, and that's probably when we first started getting PMs at Trello. Because you really have to make sure that everybody that's doing the work, meaning the developers, designers, they are very close to the customers and they know what customers need and that they have all of the information so that the decisions they make are correct. That you don't have to come in and intervene and say, oh no, I'll do it differently.
Yeah.
So now as you scale and the number of customers you have and their needs are more complex and you're like, oh, congratulations, we have to worry about GDPR or something. Somebody has to manage that complexity and that's PMs can come into that. The other one where you can have is like, we have some sense of a product market fit, but what are we going to charge for this thing? So now if you say, okay, well, designers, developers, all these people, they can figure something out and say, this roughly looks right. But if you're the PM account, looking at revenue, you're the one who's like, the difference between NRR and MRR, and you're running like bandwidth and rope studies to figure out what the pricing is, developing the model. And, it's just that becomes a lot more, it's a different sense of work. So I think for us, I think at Trello, the first big thing that we had a product manager on was making Trello international, because that required a lot of coordination. Like, you have to do all the work of changing all the strings in the app, but then you have to figure out, are we going to get the translations? You have to figure out like which markets are we going to launch this thing in and all that, which is much more complex than just the developer trying to figure out. But I think when you're in the initial stage of just trying to figure something out, I wouldn't get a product manager, because then it's basically everybody's responsibility to go meet with all the customers and know intimately what's going on.
Did your expectations about, for example, internationalization change then? Because I'd say like for a lot of people using different products, especially like maybe from smaller countries, et cetera, like, you use an app in English and it's fine. But how important is like expanding to these markets, or has it been?
Yeah, so that was not something that I did. That was actually somebody else's project. But I think there's a difference between localization and internationalization, which is localization, or one of the big whichever one, is like you just go in and you're just changing the text, right? The other one is like you figure out really what the local market is like and you tailor the product to them. So I remember when we were going to do Brazil, mobile was very big there. And then me and another designer, we actually went to Rio. And we like worked from there essentially for a little bit, and we got like the same phones that everybody has there.
Yes.
And we got to learn a lot, because you're like, oh, actually, here you're just used to having perfect service all the time, unlimited data, all these things. You go there and it's like, okay, this cell service is very spotty, and you only have 30 megabytes a day. How are you going to make your app work there? So you're like, okay, well, we actually have to make sure that it works well. We've got the connection. You have to make sure you're using a little data. You have to make sure it works well on this $50 phone and not your $1,000 iPhone, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference between tailoring it. Now, there's the other part of it, which is the go-to-market. If you just change the strings and all that, it might work, but you can't just use the same language or the same strategy and all these things. So, yeah, that was a big experience for us. We did a lot of other things on there too, actually. For other markets, we did like A/B. But we didn't do A/B testing, but we had some markets where we're just going to change the strings and see how it goes. And then we had some where we had like full court go-to-market. I think France, and it was like we got all these interviews, and I happened to be in Europe at the time. It was actually around the time of the Shift conference, I think.
Yeah, 2016.
And I went to like Paris, and like they put me in. I did all of these like talking events and all these things, and just to see which market, like what works better. And that actually worked way better than just changing the language.
So another big moment was, of course, maybe the biggest for Trello, the acquisition. And let's talk a bit about how you survived that, because we know it can be quite stressful. Trello had around 100 employees then.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
19 million users, if I'm not mistaken. How did product management changed before and after that?
Yeah, I think that acquisition was interesting. It's like, I remember we did these things called Trello Together, which is like we bring the whole company together because we're remote into one location. And this one was at like Four Seasons in Arizona. And then one morning it was like, we have a breakfast, everybody be there at sharp on this.
And you had no idea?
Yeah, I didn't know. Yeah. It was a very, 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 very small team at Trello that was like involved in all that. Just so we're randomizing it. Nobody really knew. And then, Michael, the CEO of Trello, he comes up like, hey guys, I have something to tell you. And then he's going through this presentation and he's like, okay, so we're being acquired by Atlassian, and we're already like pull up our phones. And honestly, the first thing that I hear is somebody saying, no. Yeah, that was like a very emotional day for everybody, because you were working on this thing for so long and it became your baby, and now somebody's taking that from you.
And it's a big org.
Yeah, and it's challenging, and then you work through a lot of these emotions, being like, okay, well, it's happening, right?
You can't do anything about it.
Yeah, and then Michael was saying, he's like, every time he told somebody, it would always be this chain, which would be like, okay, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for the company, and all these things? So, and then you're like, okay, well, how much equity do I have? You kind of start going down that path, and yeah. So it was a very emotional time. But I think one of my favorite books is called Design of Business, and has a couple chapters on why acquisitions fail. And essentially just becomes like, you think you need this company, you bring them in, and you impose your stuff onto the company, and then the company dies, and you're like, oh, what actually went wrong? Mm-hmm. And Atlassian did not act that way. I think the first meeting between Michael and MCB, the founder of Atlassian, was like, tell me about the culture of your company. What are you trying to do? That's the only thing they talked about. They didn't talk about anything else. Okay. And then it evolved into, this, okay, well, let's do this thing together. And it was a very big acquisition for Atlassian, because I think it basically was spending all of the cash they had.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it was very, very big. So the integration process, it was basically like, okay, well, now we're part of this. Atlassian is going to do everything needed to help supercharge your growth, and we're going to be a little hands-off. One thing that I think was very good is that basically for like, okay, so you now have this, you've acquired this company. How do you start integrating a little bit? And we started a little bit, honestly, I think, with the people, meaning we had a bunch of open roles, and there were people from Atlassian who wanted to come over. Oh. There was a bunch of people that moved over from Sydney to New York and from other places to help with that. And that was amazing. And I think the cultures of the two companies were very similar, which I think helped quite a bit.
You wouldn't think that because the size difference.
Yeah. I think if you have your culture and your values set right, and you apply them throughout your life cycle of the company, the size may not be that important. Now, the thing that changes, it's like, okay, well, how you allocation of funding, administrative. If you need a new computer, you no longer just say, hey, can I just get this a computer and just get it shipped to you. You have to go to IT, and then they, you know, those little things change, right?
That sounds familiar.
That sounds very familiar.
Yeah, and that's just like a matter of scale, you know, because at some point you want to have the fewest number of machines and standardize and all that. So just those things change. Yeah, and then there is this part of like, you know, we were little competitors before, and now there's that energy that you kind of have to get used to, and you have to start saying we, which is usually was the kind of like, that's the part where you can feel like this thing is happening. Now, I do think there was one mistake that Atlassian made with the integration of Trello, which is they had this like almost like hands-off Trello for a year. So if you were another part of Atlassian and you wanted to do something with Trello, you had to go through the integration office before you could come and say, hey, can we do this?
Oh.
And that was just basically done to like isolate us from like thousands of people coming at us being like, you're the hot new thing, can we do something?
Yeah.
But I think that also had the downside of not having us as exposed and as integrated as quickly. So I probably would have done that a little differently in retrospect.
And how did your work as a product person change? Did it?
I think that's actually when I first became like an official product person, because they were like, okay, well, we have to put you into like some career ladder somewhere.
We have these boxes.
And then I was like, okay, now you're a product manager. I think that was the first official level and all of that stuff.
Or did you not notice it because it was slow?
At the beginning, I was just like, I think at some point as the company kind of grows, and I had to kind of do this earlier at Trello, and I think this is really hard, because it was just 5 of us. I knew everything was going on, and I could just work on anything that I really wanted. And even when we got to 50, and then especially at 100, it's like, well, my world is this. And I need to be heads down on this. I need to be aware of these other things, but I'm not gonna, the localization, I was like, I'm running mobile. I will do what you need. I will consult or whatever, but I'm not going to be over your shoulder or doing something like that. So at that point, I was like, I just need to focus on doing what I'm doing, and then, we will see. Eventually, the integration part of this integration became my, somebody on my team was in charge of that, and then I became very involved. And there were a lot of things that were very, very helpful from Atlassian. So just, one of the jobs that I had at Trello was like, essentially growth, how much revenue and money we're bringing in. And Atlassian's pretty good at that. So it was, I got to work with a lot of the strategy people, and, we got to hire somebody very good at that kind of a thing to be on the team and kind of figure out some of these highly scientific, complex analyses you can do to figure out exactly what your packages and prices and all that stuff should be, which is something I would have never thought of if we were just Trello by ourselves.
You said that everything was emotional, which is understandable. But for you personally, what did you like the most after acquisition, and what did you dislike the most?
About the acquisition?
Yeah, and the period after that.
Yeah, no, I think for me, through Atlassian, it was honestly the people. I mentioned earlier that a lot of people from Atlassian came over to work from Trello, and they were all like amazing, not just, technical ability or whatever, but amazing as people. I got my mentor, through that acquisition, and that helped me grow so much. And all of that stuff was amazing, honestly. And I think just me as a person and my career and all that stuff grew quite a bit. And I evolved quite a bit because of the acquisition. I think, the thing that's the hardest is honestly that is just that emotional part of, I think there's 2. I think one is like somebody's not taking your baby. And even though it wasn't like I didn't own Trello, but I still felt like I owned it, and it was, it was my blood, sweat, and tears in it. And now everybody's going to do all these things to it that you don't really have a lot of control over, and that was really hard.
Everybody's touching my baby.
Yeah. And the second one, honestly, was just, you have to let go with that of a lot of your ego, because there will be a lot of decisions made that you will not be consulted on, because that's just a side effect of scale, right? Because now it'd be like the CEOs get together and figure out what are we going to do, and then other people do it. Now, later part of my career, I got to kind of be exposed to a lot of those, like what do the CEOs actually want to do? And then I realized it's not as like sexy as I thought it was going to be. But you do have to kind of learn to let go which is hard. It's like your strengths and weaknesses are two sides of the same coin. And if you're somebody who has a lot of drive and a lot of ownership, the downside is like when these things are happening outside of whatever you're doing, it's hard. So that was the hardest part, I think. The other part, is like, that's really, really hard is, and I think this sort of happen no matter what, but as the company grows and as you scale, sometimes you will get into a situation where like what people want to do and what the role is that you have available on the team is different. So sometimes people leave for that. Sometimes you have to have some hard conversations. And I think that is just very, very difficult and challenging of just managing through that.
So at one point during, after the transition and inflation, you took a sabbatical. Was it just like, okay, enough scaling up to that point, or what did you need? What do you think you needed a sabbatical at that point in your career?
I think at that point, basically, I was just basically working since I was like 13 or 14. Mm-hmm. And for the last like 10 something years, I've been working on one thing. I also was burnt out, honestly, because it's like there's only for so long that you can go so hard at it. And I felt like I needed that break. That was essentially it. Mm. And part of me was like, this would be, a great experience. Mm-hmm. Of just like the notion of not working was just so wild to me that I was like, I have to try this, and I was fortunate enough to have enough savings to be able to do that.
I had to try this not working.
Yeah, I mean, it was so strange where you're like every day, because when I was working at Trello, I remember I would be at the office sometimes at 5 a.m.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God.
And it would be like, I have a whole day now. Like, what do I do?
So how did that period look? Did you adjust quickly?
So yes, I did. I thought I would be bored. I was really not bored at all. Mm-hmm. And I got to do a lot of fun things. So.
But before that, you were still at Atlassian.
Yeah.
As I understood, your role was twofold. On one hand, you were guiding overall production, and on the other hand, you were guiding merger and acquisitions.
So in the last role at Atlassian, essentially, I came over to work for my mentor, and I had a special projects role, which was I didn't really have a role. It was basically just like you do what is needed and you're kind of just helping out the broader team. So the things that I spent a lot of time doing was product strategy, especially around our like platform, meaning like how do we build products? How do we expose that to the developers? What is that downstream implications of that? So for example, like if you want to buy a company, what does that change around the deal model, kind of working with essentially the entire company on defining that and changing it. So that was one big area that I was working on. And then the other one was like M&A. So if you wanted to buy a company within the org that I was supporting, you can't, like I would be your Sherpa essentially to figure out, well, who do you want to buy? Why do you want to buy them? What is the what is the justification? How we're going to make, just all of those things.
Yeah.
And then there was just a lot of like regular like operational firefighting. Like there's a fire here, please go put it out as needed, right? So
how did you get to that role?
Well, I think mid 2020, I think it was, I was very burnt out from Trello and I was talking to my mentor. And she was like, just come work for me.
And who was your mentor?
So she's, her name is Anu, and she's now, she was, I think, VP product then, and now she's president of Atlassian. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the best leader I've ever worked with, I think, by far. But she was like, yeah, come work for me. And I was like, what am I going to do? She's like, no, we'll figure it out. And that was, in terms of like personal growth and development, after 8 years of Trello, or 9 years of Trello at that point, so refreshing to work on something else. And I felt like I really grew a lot in that 1 year or something like that. I forget how long it was actually.
So in what ways, how was that different from your previous product experience?
Well, I got to work on at essentially a much higher level,
strategically in that sense?
Yeah, much more strategic. So instead of, before I was essentially working, my organization, I think it was like 50 or 60 people total. Now I was working across almost 2,000 people. And just the things that I was doing were very, very different. So I would often be exposed to essentially how is Atlassian as a company run, working on some of those really, really big problems that are going to be facing Atlassian, not now, but in 5 years. Kind of existential things. I got to work more with the founders, and I really got to see how some of those really difficult decisions are made. And there were some surprising things. I think for me, I thought this is like some super fancy, and it's honestly the same thing. Like the same way that your average product manager would approach a problem, that's how you would kind of work through the really, really big problems that threaten the company. Obviously, it was a lot more at stake. The rigor was a lot higher. Quality of work and execution, all that stuff was like orders of magnitude better, but it was the same. Mm-hmm. And the other part was that a lot of the fun work of like making the stuff and all that didn't happen there. It would be somebody else is doing all the fun stuff, and then you're just kind of keeping track of it essentially in your head.
Did you miss that fun work? Or was it understandable? Like, okay, now I'm working on strategy.
I felt that I was learning and growing a lot during that time. That that helped a lot. I think, yes, of course, I missed it. And there were times when I would, just like, we're building a new developer platform. Like, is it going well or not? And I would just sit down, open my computer, and I'm just going to use the new developer platform to try to make something. And then you kind of reconcile that against the 5-year goals. And then you're like, maybe we need to talk about something here, or maybe we don't. I don't know, right? So it was a lot of that. You have to kind of figure out when to go really deep and then when to kind of stay at a high level.
So you mentioned that you also put out fires from time to time. How does firefighting look at a company of Atlassian's size in terms of the product and so on? What are the kinds of fires?
At scale, fires happen when something in the process breaks or there is some unexpected piece of information that comes in. So you have fires even at a small scale. When I was doing stuff at Trello with mobile, sometimes you would get an email from Apple saying that you have to do something or we will do something.
Okay.
And that becomes a fire immediately.
Sounds like Apple.
Yeah, they were a great partner in many aspects, but there are frustrating aspects of working with them as well. And that's a fire, right? And it's like you put down everything and then you go after it, right? Mm-hmm. And larger companies, you have the same thing, right? Now that could happen. The same thing can happen. It could be a customer issue, all of that stuff. Or you sometimes get, because you're operating at a larger scale, you no longer know everything that's going on. And now there's something that comes up and you're like, this is completely out of whack with what we're doing. We need to adjust course here. And then that's actually quite a bit harder because then you have to figure out how do you do that in a way that doesn't burn your relationships with a team and in a way that doesn't erode trust. So if you need to adjust the direction of the team, you have to figure out how to do that, for example. I made a few mistakes at some times, but I think the way that I found that works the best, that it's usually an issue of information sharing. And then you just come in and you together say, well, here's all of the information about what we're trying to do, how everything fits together. Like, let's talk through what does that mean for your strategy, and then you let them figure it out rather than you just coming and telling them do this, which is, you're not going to scale yourself doing it that way. So that's the way that I approached it personally.
So to me, it sounds like when the fires were smaller, in a smaller team, you would put out the fire. In a large organization, you are more of the coordinator, mediator between the firefighters doing the actual.
Yeah, and it just depends what the fire is, right? If it's something essentially, you have to, obviously you would see, CEOs come in, but if it's not, then you kind of let the team do it, but you keep an eye on it. And I think the one thing that becomes a skill that you have to develop is storytelling. How do you prevent the fires, right? And then it becomes share all of the information so that everybody has all of the right information as they're doing the job. So you don't have to come in and course correct a lot. So if you're a leader and you're finding yourself doing a lot of course correction, you're failing probably in storytelling. You're not telling them a compelling enough story and sharing all the information. Or the second one actually is just process. When it's just a bunch of people working, a couple people working on something, you don't need that much process. When you have 100 people working on something, you have to have process. It can be minimal process or whatever, but you have to define how everything fits together. How are we going to review, coordinate, and align? so that the right information comes up at the right time. So it's probably one of those two things that the failures in those two things can cause fires, I think.
When talking about leadership, you mentioned that your mentor was quite a good leader, and that's why she became president of Atlassian. What do you think makes a good leader on that role, being president, CEO for a scale-up?
So I think there's a difference, I'm personally not at that level, so it's kind of weird to,
From your perspective.
from my perspective, yeah. No, I mean, I think to be a good leader in like a large organization, it kind of just comes down to like people first, honestly. And I think one is like, can you give the people the right information, the right context, and all those things to do their job? Can you organize the system in a way that helps them do their best work? Can you support them throughout whatever they need and all those things? So there's that one part. The other one is, I would say, not being afraid to make very big bets and knowing how to execute them in a low risk way. So if you're you have to be willing, I think, to bet the company or your career or whatever on something. And you have to know how to break whatever the bet is into small, non-risky parts so that they all ladder up to the outcome that you want. Or if it's not going to work, that you fail fast. So I think there is this skill of, you shoot bullets, then you shoot cannonballs. So if we say, we're going to do this really big thing that can change the entire company or Accenture or something, you figure out, okay, well, what is a small thing you can do to see if it's going to work or not? And if that proves out, then you shoot the cannonball after it.
So testing first and then.
Yeah. And I think that's a little abstract, but just to make it concrete, for example, like if you're saying, one of the things that we did at Trello was, we're going to need to change the product direction and do this big thing. And before you say, okay, well, let's all work on this, change everybody working on it. Like we need to just verify that this actually is the right thing to do. So we, let's pick a small feature from this thing that we want to do. Let's implement it quickly. Let's put it in the hands of some people, see what it does, and then reconcile the learnings from that with the other stuff that we had. So we had like pricing studies, we had customer feedback and all that stuff. All those things tied together, and now you have a lot more confidence to say, okay, well, now I'm going to put 2 teams on this. Let them do their thing, and you're like, okay, well, this worked. What did we learn? Okay, now you can put the whole company on it.
Makes sense. In your talk at Shift Conference in 2016, you talked a lot about like team ownership, how important it is, like as well as organizational structure. Like through your experience, your career, like again from Trello, the startup, Trello, the ScaleUp, and Atlassian. How were these things like team ownership and the structure different? And also how did they, again, influence the product development and help or?
Yeah, so I think general, when you're designing teams, I think you need to have, I spend a lot of time talking about making sure they have all the right things, all the right information, all the right resources, all that stuff. The other 2 things that they have to have is they have to have ownership around whatever they're doing. And they also need to have accountability over whatever they're doing. Mm-hmm. So yes, for example, you're launching a new product or a new feature. You have full ownership of what it's going to do, how it's going to look, how it's going to perform. The other thing you get with that is you get full accountability. If it doesn't work, it's on you, right? So I think those are things that are very, very important. And I don't mean to say that like harshly in a way to say, well, you're going to get fired if it doesn't work. What I think that does is that it actually gives you a very sharp focus and a mandate to think much more broadly than whatever the line of code that you're writing, or if you're a product manager, like how does this thing fit into this ecosystem? You need to think end to end. How are we going to market this? How are we going to sell it? Does it all fit together?
You also talk about little delighters that help users in using that product and feeling them a bit more better about it. Do you think scale-ups can also think in that way as well, like creating products, or is it reserved only for smaller startups like Trello?
Well, I will say that, looking back, like the things that made Trello were actually that thing.
Yeah. I love that.
All of the stuff that really made us successful, it wasn't like a product manager deciding we're going to do this. It was some random developer somewhere being like, look what I did.
Yeah.
And then the Trello, we had one who was very good at that, and a couple of others that were also good at it. And they would just sometimes drop a link, and then you click it, and you're like, your mind is blown. And you're like, then your job becomes, let's ship this. You know, then you have to create a lot of space for creativity. Now, how do you enable that in a large organization? There's a few ways. So you can say, okay, well, you'll see a lot of companies, they'll say innovation weeks, where you can do whatever you want. So there's one way to do that. The challenge then becomes like, when in 1 week is usually not enough to implement the thing. So you need to have a pipeline into the full product feature set and how do you ship it. So there's that, there's that one way to do it. Now you can't just ship it because you may say, okay, well, actually there's a regulation in Europe that this breaks. So we have to think about that, right? Another way that you see it happen is, especially in the large, if you have 1,000 people, you can say, well, how do I allocate some resources to this? Because you're not going to be sitting there looking at all the ideas. You just want to make sure the organization has it. So you can say, you use a model like McKinsey has like a 70-20-10 model, which you say, 70% of our time is spent on things that are like the most important right now, 20% are things that are important next year, and 10% are like the really big wild bets. So you say, I'm going to dedicate, if I have 1,000 developers, I'm going to say that, 50 or 20 at any time are working on this, something that's far out. And then you can come up with a framework, So you'll see a lot of big companies, they'll have these like venture studios where you can come up and, I have an idea for a product, I want to make it, and that's where you go, and then you figure it out to do it. But yeah, so I think that's important across any part. But the challenge is in funding those in the really large organizations is that, if you're somebody with a great idea and you come to the table, you'd be like, what metric does it move?
Yeah.
I don't know, it's cool, and then there's like a skill in knowing when to ignore data and just say, I like your thing, we're going to ship it.
Sense and sensibility, yeah.
Yeah.
So after Atlassian, you transitioned to Uber, where you, as I understand it, again, took something from 0 to 1, right? Groceries. How did, again, that change the perspective? Did you get back to some things that you worked in Trello early on? Were you doing it differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, when I was ready after my sabbatical to do something else, I kind of, looked at a lot of companies, interviews, offers, whatever. And I was looking at a lot of like B2B SaaS. And to me, that just felt like I'd done 10 years of this. I want to do something completely different. And Uber was that for me, and I worked on grocery delivery, which basically was like almost non-existent at that point. Completely different than selling software. You're trying to figure out how to deliver groceries from one end to another. So it was very much 0 to 1. And I think at that point, I kind of always had this thing in my mind of like, how do you go 0 to 1 with anything? And I feel like I did that a few times at Trello, and then I was like doing a little bit at Atlassian as well. And now I'm like, okay, now bring into this role, like, what is the framework? And I always have this thing, which is like, it's a sequence of numbers, which is like 1, 2, 5, 10, 100. So when you have nothing, your job is to get something. It doesn't really matter what it is. You just have to make sure it's roughly in line what you're trying to do, and then you get 1. Because at that point, you're no longer trying to get something off the ground. You have 1, you're iterating. And then you're like, okay, well, I have 1, I have to go in and get another 1. And when you get the second one, that forces you to find commonalities, figure out what's similar, what's not, and adjust. And then from there on, it becomes about how do you make that repeatable. Then you get to 5 and you have inklings of repeatability. At 10, it becomes more than one person can handle. Then now you have something that looks like a playbook, and at 100, you've kind of figured out what that playbook looks like. And a lot of my job at Uber was honestly just getting a lot of the inventory onto the platform. Like they released super large, grocery chains. I get them onto the platform. And it was literally that. There's nothing, get something. And, at some point, this is, we had a platform, we're trying to get people on, it was a little tricky or whatever. And then you just do whatever it takes. So at some point I was, I remember sitting in a conference room with somebody in operations, calling couriers to be like, hey, this thing they ordered to replace, this is all this thing, this is all accurate, right? Which is not a job that like somebody in product would ever really do. But that's what it took to get to the 1. And then by the time we were doing 10, I was like, okay, well, we have like a playbook here. So now we need to just make sure that the operations teams are stood up in all of the various regions and this is exactly what they need to do. And that is kind of that playbook that I think is pretty effective, at least for me.
Yeah.
But it does require a lot of kind of stepping out of boundaries of your role. And I think it goes back to the whole ownership and accountability thing, which is like you have ownership, but you also have accountability. And you can't say, oh, somebody else didn't do their job. Well, guess what? That's also your job.
And what other lessons did you bring to Uber from Trello and Atlassian, and you use them?
I think that's probably I think the biggest one. That just, having some, I think there's this, and I'm a little bit in this now, honestly, because I'm trying to do my own company, and it's like, it's scary not to have anything to work on and work with. And then you need to pick a thing, and then you need to go hard at it. And it's very, very easy to just get lost in all the possibilities. And I think if you just have the only thing that matters is just getting one, it allows you to focus on something that you can actually achieve and get over the line.
You already communicate with your users via email, just like Trello, but you use SMS, WhatsApp, or Apple Messages like Uber. Our InfoYip messaging platform is built for scale-ups just like yours. Companies like Uber, Meta, and HubSpot use it every day for all their users. For more information, check out the link in the description.
So you said you're working on your own thing. What is it?
Well, it's AI like everybody else. Yeah. So for me, it was, after a little over a year at Uber, I was like, I really want to get into this.
You were doing some machine learning at Uber?
Yeah, we were doing a bunch of machine learning for getting all these products in. It was quite a bit of ML, and I was like starting to see the possibilities. I was like, I have to do something of my own. When I'm 80, I'm going to regret not doing it. So this is the right time. I must do it. And I honestly didn't have an idea. I knew it was going to be AI. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have a co-founder. I had nothing. But that's part of it. Like you just have to sometimes jump and then be like
0 to 1.
Yeah, honestly. And then you're like, at least I'll grow as a person out of this. So then I looked at a bunch of ideas. I looked at like legal and accounting and some of the stuff in like project management. And then I started talking to my current co-founder. We started looking at construction. And we saw that the way that very large construction projects are run, so over $100 million, is wildly inefficient. And it's causing massive delays and budget overruns and just kind of creating, a $200 billion problem in the industry. The other thing that we saw is that all of the current solutions that exist are literally unable to address that problem because of some peculiarities about the construction industry, of the project model, a bunch of companies working together, a massive amount of unstructured data, and a few other things. And we saw this is a perfect opportunity for AI, especially generative AI like LLMs. So that's what we're building. We're just kind of building this company that we're aiming to put the management of these large construction projects on autopilot and saving, billions and billions and billions of dollars. So now what that actually means, all of these things, and where do you start? That's the hard problem of going 0 to 1 and then getting 2. But when you get the first one, it's very rewarding.
And of course, we have to ask you the last question. Do you still use Trello?
I actually don't. I think it's an amazing product, and it's a lot of love and effort put into using it. I think for me, and this is going to sound weird, is I'm not a very organized person.
That is very weird.
Yeah.
So it's not the case that I'm like, I'm using Asana or something. It's just that I'm very disorganized, which is a weakness. So I use a lot of pen and paper, honestly, and send myself emails and all of those things.
Now I feel far better with sending emails to you. So
it's the best.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll wake up at 3 a.m. and be like, oh my God, I forgot to do this thing. Take my phone, send myself an email, and I can go to bed.
Bulletproof method. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching this episode with Hamid. Now learn how to scale not 1, but 2 unicorns with Jason Cohen.